Okay, so what exactly is a shadow fleet, and why did the United States seize an oil tanker coming from Venezuela? And also, at the same time, why is Iran's economy collapsing? And why are all of these things related? Well, my friends, the first two questions that we just asked are ones that most people, either this past week or the week prior, or even the week prior to that, depending upon the time this video actually goes out, were asking when the news broke that the US military had seized a Venezuelan oil tanker in the Caribbean on December 10th, 2025, as well as indicated that additional seizures would occur in the future. As for why this happened in the first place, according to the US government, the vessel called the Skipper belongs to an Iranian shadow fleet that was helping the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps go and evade sanctions that are in place against it and the state, as they're quite literally some of the world's largest state sponsors of terrorism. The Skipper had been under surveillance by US regulators for years, having previously transported cargoes from Iran. And this last month, the Skipper had reportedly used spoofing techniques, which is broadcasting false location details, to falsely project its location being off of Guyana, when in fact it was loading an oil cargo in Venezuela's Jose terminal. And so I guess actually right there from the beginning that answers the first two questions immediately, literally within the first 1 to 2 minutes. Okay, that is definitely an unusual thing when it comes to this channel, considering how quite a number of our videos go, as you all are probably aware by this point. But that seems far too simple, and it doesn't really go and answer the nitty-gritty of the how and why we got here. So, yeah, welcome everyone. On today's episode, we're going to be diving into the Iranian shadow fleet and what it means for the economy of Iran, which has been limping along for decades, but now finds itself under ever-increasing strain, and at some point may just outright collapse. We are reaching that point here soon. It is looking worse and worse as time is going on. Which, on that note, if you did not see the video that we did here on the Iranian water crisis fairly recently, I do recommend that you go back and check that out, as that does establish a lot more of the background and context of the issues that Iran has been facing. We will be explaining some of the troubles that have been mentioned here before, but I don't want to repeat myself too much because, again, we literally just did that video. So instead of going back by hundreds of years, we need to instead focus on the times that are more relevant to the modern state of Iran and the nitty-gritty of the economy besides just agriculture like we had here before with the water video, and instead talk about the 20th and 21st century with it. And so, with all that being said here, my friends, let's go ahead and dive into some context as we explain why the Shadow Fleet came into being, how it operates, and what it means with what is currently happening in Iran's economy, which again, absolutely appears to be collapsing by the way. But genuinely, arguably, the worst part about this entire thing has been trying to sort through all the varying different sources talking about this subject, because there are so many different government ones that depending upon who is telling you the story, you're going to get completely different versions. Whether it is something that is aligned with the United States, with Russia, with China, with Venezuela, with any of it, it is just so incredibly difficult to sort through. And that, my friends, is why I'm so grateful to be sponsored by Ground News. Yeah, if you haven't heard of Ground News by now, I'm not sure why. They're one of the long-term sponsors of this channel, and they're one of the only reasons that I'm able to present information to you as least a biased a way as possible. What Ground News does is it takes hundreds of different articles talking about the same subject, and it will rate them. It will look at whether they are left-wing, whether they are right-wing, it'll look at whether they are factual or whether they exaggerate things, or more importantly, and this is the thing that is really factoring into a lot of the stuff that I talk about, who owns the specific source, whether it is a conglomeration, whether it is some kind of private source, or whether it is a government source that is talking about something. This is so important because for this video itself, almost every single thing that we are using comes from some type of government source. And understanding the bias of said government is imperative to understanding the story itself so that you yourself don't get manipulated. Because no one is absolutely unbiased. I myself am not completely unbiased, though I do try to remove myself as much as possible from a specific topic. And one of the key ways that I'm able to do this is by utilizing the Vantage plan of Ground News, which if you go and click the link down in my description, you can get 40% off of said plan. This is what I use to present information to you all in as least biased a way as possible. Just about every kind of news source is trying to manipulate you in some way. Even I am trying to get you to check out my sponsor, which is something that can help you. So by all means, click the link down in my description and don't let yourself be made a fool of here in the future. Thank you, Ground News, for sponsoring my video. And now back to the show. First up, the why. We cannot talk about the Iranian shadow fleet without first talking about sanctions and the absolute fustercluck that is the Iranian economy and its international relations. In fact, that arguably is going to be the largest subject of today's video in the first place. just how bad the Iranian economy is and why it seems to be on the verge of collapse, with the Shadow Fleet acting as a kind of dialysis, if you will. So, with that being stated now, I will condense things here, but we do have to go back to the beginning. When I say this, I do not mean the beginning itself. We don't need to go back by hundreds or thousands of years. I can already see the eye rolls that are popping up here now and the comments that are going to be seen in the comment section. But rather than go back by that time, we need to instead go back to 1979 and the Islamic Revolution, the thing that established modern theocratic Iran in the first place. Because that screwed basically everything. The 1979 Islamic Revolution was not just a political change, it was an ideological one. The new theocratic regime, led by Ayatollah Khomeini, viewed the Shah's capitalist-leaning economy as something that was corrupt and Western-aligned, which, yeah, it was. There's no real arguing around it. It absolutely was. But what they did was not better. It was, in fact, significantly worse. The new theocratic Islamic State's first major economic act was to nationalize vast swaths of the private sector. Large industries, banks, and insurance companies were seized and placed under state control, oftentimes managed not even by bureaucrats like what you would see with some communist revolutions, but by revolutionary clerics with little to no understanding of any kind of economic ability whatsoever. This, of course, led to an immediate and catastrophic drop in productivity and efficiency. The managerial class, many of whom were educated abroad or tied to the old regime, fled the country in a massive brain drain, leaving a vacuum of competence that there really was no way to fill. The very next year, it would only get worse. The 1980 invasion by Iraq would force the economy into a state of total war, and the government's response was to implement what it called the economy of war. This involved a number of desperate measures with both short-term and long-term effects that we're now going to have to explain. First up, the solution many countries have come up with historically when times are tough is to print money. With oil exports being crippled by Iraqi attacks on the Karg Island terminal and global sanctions, the government's primary source of revenue vanished. To fund the war effort and pay its soldiers and employees, the Central Bank of Iran would simply print money, leading to the first major wave of inflation. Which, yes, this, of course, was a major problem. So, to prevent there being mass social unrest, the government would institute a system of rationing cards for essential goods like bread and sugar and cooking oil and things like that. Prices were frozen by decree. And while yes, this did prevent the immediate starvation of many citizens, it also created a massive black market and destroyed domestic production incentives because farmers and producers could not cover their costs at state-mandated prices, which is not a good thing. On top of all of that, the near-decade-long war would destroy critical infrastructure, including oil refineries, ports, and factories that were necessary to have a modern functioning economy. So it was then here, my friends, that by the end in 1988, Iran was exhausted. It was an isolated nation with a shattered economy, a culture of severe corruption born from the black market and also made worse from what had already existed, and a deeply ingrained inflationary mindset within the government. The cost of the war is estimated to have been the equivalent of over 40% of Iran's entire GDP for the period, setting the country back by quite literally decades. It was downright terrible, and that brings us to the 90s and the 2000s, a rather confusing and paradoxical time for the Iranian state, which I'm going to need to explain that here, because this is where sanctions really start to come into play. Under President Hashemi Rafsanjani, the government would recognize the need to rebuild. Obviously, everything is quite literally destroyed. The first 5-year development plan from 1990 to 1994 would aim to liberalize the economy, encourage foreign investment, and privatize state-owned enterprises. Which sounds pretty decent. However, this privatization was often just a complete sham, where state assets were sold to entities that were controlled by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, and other powerful foundations called bunyads, which would create a new class of state-aligned oligarchs. Like, if anything, the structure of what happened here in Iran is somewhat similar with a more religious lens of what happened to Russia in the 90s. The underlying structure and system that existed beneath all of this still remained highly inefficient and highly corrupt. Yeah, again, if you have not seen the video that I did on the Iranian water crisis and just how bad the IRGC is with its involvement in every kind of important aspect of the country, you really need to go check that out. Either way, the 1990s would see the first major US sanctions targeting Iran. Yes, there had been sanctions before, but this is where things really started to step up. Initially, these were in response to state sponsored terrorism, such as the 1995 Khobar Towers bombing in Saudi Arabia. And so by the next year, the Iran and Libya Sanction Act, or ILSA, of 1996 proved to be especially significant, as this threatened to punish foreign companies that invested more than $20 million in Iran's oil and gas sector, the largest part of its economy. While European allies initially tried to push back on this, the law created a chilling effect on any foreign investment and began the process of isolating Iran from the global financial system. So it is here then, my friends, that we start to see the origin of the shadow fleet. Early US sanctions would target specific Iranian entities and individuals. So Iran's response was relatively basic. Oftentimes just ship-to-ship transfers, or STS, in open waters in order to obscure the origin of oil. Basically, Iranian ships would go and transfer their cargo to ships of other countries, and thus they were able to hide the fact that said products were from Iran. To hide the tankers, they could turn off their AIS transponders, which would make them go dark on any international tracking systems. And this was simple enough, but it would get far more complex later, as the political and economic situation for Iran was not really going to get all that much better. The reason for this is that the election of reformist president Mohammad Khatami in 1997 was on a platform of opening up society and the economy, and this is something that raised hopes within Iran. But his administration was systematically stymied by conservative hardliners who controlled the judiciary, the parliament, and key state institutions like the IRGC. They viewed economic liberalization as just a threat to the revolution's principles and to their own power. So, every attempt at meaningful economic reform, such as reforming labor laws, trying to attract more foreign investment, curbing subsidies, all of this was blocked. This period was characterized by severe political paralysis, where the need to reform was very obvious and clear, but the will to actually do it was gone. It was just absent. So it is here then, my friends, that the government basically did nothing productive for quite literally years. But somehow, they managed to find the money to invest into a nuclear program. And that is where things really started to go haywire under the presidency of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. To explain, Ahmadinejad had emerged from the ranks of the IRGC, and he was seen as a hardline principlist, someone who was loyal to the ideals of the 1979 revolution. He won the 2005 election in a surprise runoff, positioning himself as a simple, anti-corruption man of the people, in stark contrast to the reformist and pragmatist factions that had dominated Iranian politics in the preceding years. His platform would resonate with a base that felt largely left behind by economic liberalization and alienated by what they saw as the country's moral and political drift. So really, it does make sense as to why he got into power in the first place, but once he was actually in power, that's where things really started to get screwy. Because his presidency was marked by a confrontational foreign policy, most notably his aggressive pursuit of a nuclear program, and his vitriolic rhetoric against both Israel and the West. Which, okay, sure, it does make sense to go and try and unite people behind a common cause and present them an enemy, I do get this, but the thing is, this political stance was inseparable from his domestic and economic agenda that denied basic facts of just how inflation works in the first place, creating thus a perfect storm that devastated Iran's economy. Now, I'm going to need to go and explain this because it sounds way too stupid to be real, but it is. Ahmadinejad was incredibly lucky to be president during what was arguably one of the greatest oil booms in all of human history. The price of oil would rise from under $30 a barrel in 2003 to over $140 a barrel in 2008. And this should have, from that huge surplus of money, been Iran's golden age. A chance to build a sovereign wealth fund like Norway's to secure the nation's future and develop its infrastructure. It should have been perfect, but Ahmadinejad's deep-seated belief in a state-controlled economy, coupled with his revolutionary zeal, led him to systematically sideline the traditional private sector, this being the bizarre merchants, and empower the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps as the nation's main economic engine. And so no, I am not kidding. This military organization became what essentially was an armed theocratic mega corporation, which sounds more like a build that someone would make in Stellaris than real life, but it happened. The IRGC, especially its engineering arm, Qatam Al Anbiya, was awarded no bid contracts for multi billion-dollar projects in oil, gas, construction, telecommunications. You name it, if it is important for the nation, the IRGC did it, and no one else was allowed to compete with them. They could do whatever it is that they wanted. And these were often technically complex projects that the IRGC had no experience in whatsoever, which would lead to massive cost overruns, delays, and poor quality. I.e., again, go check out my video on the water crisis video because we crap on so many Iranian dams in that video. The reality was, private businesses couldn't compete. The IRGC had access to cheap, state-backed credit. They didn't pay taxes. They were immune from import-export regulations. They could do whatever it is that they wanted. If a private company wanted to import machinery, they had to face bureaucracy and tariffs. The IRGC could just bring it in for free. This created an extremely uneven playing field that strangled entrepreneurship and innovation. And that is just straight up on the market side. That is not even the financial part in which it was even screwier. Under Ahmadinejad, Iran's banking system ceased to function as a commercial entity. It basically became nothing more than an arm of his political agenda. He and his allies, like the Minister of Economy, would direct state banks to provide loans to firms and projects that were, yes, politically loyal, but there was no actual ability that they had. So regardless of their credit worthiness, regardless of whether or not a project was a good idea, it would just be rubber stamped and approved. This resulted in a banking crisis where the ratio of non-performing loans to total assets, meaning loans that were not being paid back or were incapable of being paid back, would balloon to alarming levels. We're talking some economists estimating that it was over 30% of all loans in Iran. This, as you could probably guess, would starve legitimate businesses of any capital and would freeze the credit market as nothing could reasonably be relied upon. It was just downright terrible. And on top of all of that, the entire time this was happening, Iran was somehow pumping massive amounts of money into its nuclear program, to which, in response, the UN, the EU, and the United States started to impose heavier sanctions. The most effective sanctions were those imposed by the United States and EU around 2012, which would go and target Iran's ability to sell its oil and use its central bank for international transactions. This effectively cut Iran off from the global financial system, SWIFT. Iran's oil exports would plummet from around 2.5 million barrels per day to under 1 million, which meant the government's primary source of foreign currency, the dollars and euros that were needed to import everything from medicine to car parts to food, all dried up, almost immediately and completely. Oh, but wait, hold on. I did forget to mention that all of this in 2012 also came on the back of a disastrous subsidy reform attempt in 2010 that was already sending the nation spiraling into ruin, which I'm going to need to explain that part now. You see, for decades, the Iranian government had kept the price of gasoline, electricity, and natural gas, water, bread, all the essentials, if you will, artificially low. For example, before the reform, gasoline would cost around 10 cents per gallon, which meant that the state was paying the difference between the market price and the domestic price, a cost that ran into the tens of billions of dollars a year. Like, if gas was supposed to actually be $1 per gallon, but people were only being charged 10 cents, it means that for every dollar that someone was buying something, they were only paying 10 cents and the government was paying 90. Yeah, that naturally was going to get very expensive. By the 2000s, these subsidies were costing the state an estimated $60 to $100 billion per year, which was a quarter of the entire GDP of the country. Moonbeam, you heard the word subsidies and you're like, I want subsidies, feed me. No, you're too fat. One of the craziest parts about this is that this benefited the wealthy of society, those who could afford more cars and bigger homes and things like that, disproportionately more than the poor. But still, many of Iran's poor relied upon these subsidies to keep the lights on, both figuratively and also quite literally. The problem was that it drastically encouraged waste and overconsumption. In fact, Iran's per capita energy consumption became one of the highest in the world, even higher than a lot of European nations. And the massive price difference with the neighboring countries made fuel smuggling a highly profitable illicit industry, literally fueling criminal enterprises. This system was highly unsustainable. So, obviously, reform was needed. What to do about it? Well, the plan was to eliminate these subsidies and to replace them instead with direct monthly cash payments called yarana to every Iranian family in order to compensate them for the higher prices that they were going to pay. In that sense, if each person got an equal amount, then a wealthy person with a fleet of 20 cars could not take more subsidy than 20 families with a single car each like they could do before. So, yeah, okay, this idea seems pretty simple on paper. Sure, its execution, though, that it's probably exactly what you would expect would happen when the whole thing is being done by zealous theocratic bureaucrats. It's done terribly. Instead of a gradual phase out, the government would slash subsidies almost overnight. In December of 2010, the price of gasoline would skyrocket from 1,000 reals per liter to 4,000, and later to 7,000. Electricity and natural gas prices would jump by several 100%, which sent massive shock waves through the entire economy. The immediate effect, as you can imagine from that, was rampant inflation. For any business, transportation costs, manufacturing costs, and heating or cooling costs all skyrocketed. These costs were passed directly onto consumers. The yarana cash payments were fixed. They didn't go up as other prices went up. And so as the cost of living surged, it became less and less and less able to do anything. A family that received a payment that was the equivalent to $40 a month soon found that that amount couldn't even cover the increased cost of their monthly grocery bill. This, in turn, led to mass devaluation of the rial. The plan created a new fiscal burden on the government. To fund the cash payments and to cover their own now much higher costs, the government began to simply print money. This dramatically increased the money supply without a corresponding increase in economic output, which is literally the textbook recipe for hyperinflation and currency devaluation. The rial soon began its steep fall against the dollar during this period. And so, yeah, as you would probably expect then, this policy shattered what little middle class there was within Iran. A salaried teacher or engineer whose wages were fixed would see their purchasing power utterly annihilated. While the poorest would receive cash payments, they were now forced to pay market rates for energy, oftentimes leading them to reduce consumption for heating in the winter, creating genuine hardship. The promise of targeting subsidies was a complete lie. It became instead a blunt instrument of economic chaos that wrecked the entire nation. Oh yeah, and remember what I said earlier? This is also when the global sanctions began to really hit in 2012, which created a horrible feedback loop, because somehow, the government, despite all of this, found money to invest into a nuclear program. The feedback loop basically went like this. Oil revenue fell, the government ran out of foreign currency, and because the government couldn't pay for imports, that meant that there was a severe shortage of essential goods. This, of course, then led to shortages and panic buying, and so prices on the black market would skyrocket, and to get any foreign currency, people and businesses would rush to sell their reals so that they could get dollars or euros or things like that, which would cause the value of the rial to collapse. That collapsing currency then made imports even more expensive, so hyperinflation would become entrenched and just continue. Again and again and again, repeating that cycle. By the end of 2012, the situation was dire. The rial had lost over half of its value in just a few months. Inflation was estimated to be over 40%, and store shelves were oftentimes completely empty, with the standard of living for the average Iranian plummeting. The economic disaster was total, and it was a direct result of Ahmadinejad's toxic mix of radical ideology, economic incompetence, and a foreign policy that invited crippling international responses. At this point, the only lifeline that Iran really had here was its shadow fleet. To survive, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and the National Iranian Oil Company began to systematically build out a secret shipping network. To begin, they would go and purchase aging single-hull tankers, oftentimes decades out of date by this point, and oftentimes flagged in obscure jurisdictions like Tanzania or Panama or Moldova, things that were less scrutinized and cheaper to operate off the books. The next step was creating a complex web of shell companies, oftentimes in places like the UAE, Hong Kong, or the Marshall Islands, things that were needed to own and operate these vessels that weren't totally Iranian. Oftentimes, these companies were nothing more than just a P.O. box or an empty single room in an office building that, technically speaking, bore the company's name, but there was no one there. This made it incredibly difficult to trace the tankers back to Iran, and that is if you could even find them in the first place. The reason for this is that the fleet's operators would gradually become masters of dark activity. They would routinely disable AIS transponders, falsify cargo documents, changing the origin from Iran to Iraq or Malaysia or something like that, and engage in STS transfers far from shore, oftentimes in the Strait of Malacca or near the coast of West Africa, where it would be difficult for anyone to do anything about it. As time went on, vessels began using software-defined radios to clone multiple identities. To explain this, the ship MT Happiness 1, as just an example, would simultaneously broadcast as 3 different vessels in 3 different locations. That is just what it would do in order to be able to hide. To hide the ships better, the International Maritime Organization, or IMO numbers that were on the hulls, were physically altered using specialized welding techniques. The MT Diona is just one example of a ship that was altered, had its IMO number changed 3 times in 14 months. That is how fast they are doing it in order to hide these things so that they don't get caught. Really, the possibilities here were truly endless, and once the cargo was sold, there were 3 Malaysian banks, the Ambank Islamic, the RHB Bank, and the CIMB Islamic, would go and process payments through Islamic finance loopholes, which would make the transactions appear as being religiously compliant rather than being related to oil. Anything and everything was done to keep this under wraps so that it could not be traced back to Iran. People knew that it could be traced back to Iran, but it was difficult to outright prove. Thus, a desperate financial lifeline was kept for the state. A lifeline that, due to the events of the mid to late 2010s, as we just talked about, and what we're going to explain more, this would be forced to grow rapidly. What I mean by that is that the election of President Hassan Rouhani in 2013 would bring about a shift in policy aimed at resolving the nuclear issue and alleviating economic pressure. Intense multinational negotiations would culminate in the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA, commonly known as the Iran nuclear deal, in July of 2015. The way that that worked is that in exchange for verifiable limits on its nuclear activities, such as capping uranium enrichment levels and centrifuge numbers, and extensive IAEA inspections, Iran would receive significant sanction relief. And they did. All nuclear-related sanctions were lifted. Iran was reconnected to the global financial system, including SWIFT, albeit, of course, with still some limitations, and frozen assets, estimated at over $100 billion, were made accessible for them. Iran's oil exports would surge back to pre-sanction levels, reaching 2.5 million barrels per day by 2016. Oil revenue would jump from under $30 billion in 2013 to over $60 billion in 2017. This was amazing for Iran. The influx of dollars would stabilize the currency, the rial, which had been trading on the black market at over 40,000 to the dollar. This would strengthen to around 32,000. Not great, but still it was better than what it had been. Inflation would fall to single digits, around 9 to 10% or so, for the first time in quite literally decades. Because of this, GDP grew by over 12% in 2016. And that, again, is amazing because if you think about it, if your inflation was 9%, but your economy grew by 12%, that means overall you have a net positive 3% growth. That sounds amazing. And yeah, it absolutely was for Iran. But, here's the thing. Despite the recovery, the structural flaws that we've already talked about here before with the Iranian economy and state, those were not addressed at all. The bonyads and the state-owned enterprises, all those things that were horribly corrupt and inefficient, they remained dominant, and corruption would persist. The subsidy system was only partially reformed. The economy was still overwhelmingly dependent on a single commodity, oil. This made it extremely vulnerable to any change in sanctions. And as a result, the Shadow Fleet was kept in reserve should anything happen. And then guess what? Things happened. In the year 2018, the United States, under President Donald Trump, would unilaterally withdraw from the JCPOA and reimpose and intensify the maximum pressure sanctions of earlier years. And it was going to get bad. Now, for a number of people who are wondering why this happened in the first place, there are multiple reasons why it was done, but that is not what this video is about, and I do not want to get into a whole other topic in detail. But in short, Trump's stance was that the agreement did not do enough to limit Iran's nuclear ambitions because its limits were timed. And also, it did nothing about Iran's ballistic missiles or support for terrorist proxies all around the world. Regardless of why it happened, this was an absolutely devastating blow. Oil exports would plummet by over 90%. Foreign companies would flee the country, and the Iranian rial would enter freefall, losing over half of its value immediately. The brief period of hope would end abruptly, and the economy was now going to enter a new, far more severe phase of crisis. The sharp contraction in government spending and the freezing of the private sector would push Iran into a deep recession. GDP would contract by an estimated 6.5% in 2019 alone. And so, faced with economic strangulation, the Iranian government would adopt a series of survival tactics, which oftentimes worsened the underlying problems. The COVID-19 pandemic would then only add another layer to the crisis. With oil revenue gone, the government would turn to its only remaining source of funding, the printing press. The Central Bank of Iran was ordered to print rials to finance the massive state budget deficit and to keep bloated public sector payrolls afloat. This would directly fuel the inflationary spiral, devaluing the currency further and creating a vicious cycle. To manage the currency crisis, the government would create a complex, corrupt system of multiple exchange rates. There was the official rate, which was 42,000 rials to $1 for importing essential goods, a semi-official rate, the NIMA, and the final one, the open market rate. This, as you could probably expect, would create enormous opportunities for corruption, as well-connected insiders could obtain cheap dollars at the official rate and then turn around and sell them on the black market for a stupidly big profit. This system would distort the market further and failed to stabilize the currency at basically all. The source of those dollars that they could get in the first place, you may wonder? Well, that's right, the Shadow Fleet. Remember, the nuclear deal didn't fully dismantle the Shadow Fleet, it just sent it into hibernation. The IRGC's Quds Force would maintain a strategic reserve of 18 vessels through Quds shipping lines, a Tehran-based front. 34 shadow tankers were sold to Chinese scrapyards, but instead of actually being scrapped near Zhoushan, their engines were preserved, and crews were held on retainer until they were possibly needed. And so when everything went down, they jumped into action. Trump's withdrawal would go and trigger the fleet's most aggressive expansion yet. Iran's Ministry of Petroleum would create the Oil Exports Countermeasures Headquarters, run by IRGC General Rasul Sanirad. Then, through the Dalian Shipbuilding Industry Company, Iran would acquire 76 used tankers between 2018 to 2020 via the Shanghai-based Hanasia Holdings. The total cost of this? $1.2 billion, paid in yuan through the Bank of Kunlun. Along with this, the Russian STSI, and I'm going to butcher the pronunciation of this, so get ready for it, Sovremenia Technologii Sudostroyeniai Inzinering. That thing. This Russian network would sell Iran 15 ice-class tankers that were originally built for Arctic LNG projects, but were repurposed for Caspian Sea to Black Sea routes. Such connections would actually come in handy once again a few years later, once Russia faced its own sanctions with the Russo-Ukrainian War, but that is a story for another time. In short, everything that I described about the Ghost Fleet or the Shadow Fleet before now was doubled, then tripled, and then quadrupled as the fleet rapidly expanded to try and keep the state alive. While yes, they could go through this method, selling oil to countries like China and Syria, it was oftentimes at a steep discount. And so even though, yes, this did bring in some revenue, it was a fraction of what they had lost through legitimate means. Thus it was, my friends, that into this crapshoot, COVID hits. The whole world shuts down, and every country that relies on exports begins to suffer. As Iran was already suffering, you can imagine how badly that hurt. Iran would suffer one of the world's worst initial outbreaks, overwhelming its healthcare system, which was already strained by shortages of imported medical equipment due to sanctions. Lockdowns and travel restrictions would halt what little economic activity was left, and the global pandemic would also cause a historic crash in oil prices in the early 2020s, meaning that even the smuggled oil that Iran was selling fetched a much lower price. What was even worse then, this time, was that there was not going to be any reprieve. Iran was stuck. The election of the hardline president Ibrahim Raisi in 2021 would bring promises of economic reform and an end to corruption, but the fundamental dynamics of the crisis remained unchanged. The Biden administration, while offering to re-enter the JCPOA, would maintain and even add new sanctions, particularly in response to Iran's human rights record and its support for Russia over the course of the Russo-Ukrainian war. The maximum pressure architecture remained largely in place. They were not going to get any reprieve. And so, in 2022, the Raisi administration would take the significant step of eliminating the corrupt 42,000 to 1 official exchange rate, unifying it with the NIMA rate. This was a necessary move to curb corruption, but it had an immediate, rather painful side effect: a massive spike in the price of imported goods, particularly essential food items and medicine, which sent inflation soaring even higher temporarily. Sadly for Iran, hyperinflation had become a permanent feature of the economy, not just a bug. In 2022 and 2023, inflation rates were consistently hovering between 45 and 55%, one of the highest in the entire world. The rial would continue its slow, steady decline, eventually surpassing 500,000 rials to the dollar. Along with this, rather than make any meaningful changes politically or economically, the government of Iran has instead doubled down on its resistance economy doctrine, which prioritizes self-sufficiency, boosting domestic production, and strengthening ties with Eastern powers like Russia and China to bypass the West. However, this has had rather limited success due to the lack of investment, lack of technology, and of course, horrible corruption within the state. And so that, in turn, my friends, meant that throughout 2024 and heading into 2025, that the simultaneous energy, economic, and political crisis, and paired with a 12-day war with Israel, mind you, that also happened, don't forget about that, that has practically guaranteed that there is no recovery for the state. But what does that look like? Well, around January of 2025, meat and seed cooking oil became largely unaffordable by most Iranians. On February 11th, a massive blackout would affect Tehran, as well as several major cities, as the energy grid failed. The Iranian Minister of Economy and Finances was impeached on March 1st, just a few days after the Vice President of Iran, Mohammad Javad Zarif, would step down after pressure from the public. By March 19th, the exchange rate had passed $1 to a million rial, making it, at that point, the most worthless currency in the entire world. And it just gets worse as the year goes on. The economic indicators for the final quarter of 2025 suggest a country entering a terminal stage of stagflation, with economic growth hovering at zero and official accounts of inflation projected to hit 50% by the Persian New Year. The government has resorted to what critics call state-sponsored extortion in order to try and get some revenue. Toll fees from 10 major national highways were recently hiked by as much as 120%. The move was widely seen as a desperate attempt to patch a massive budget deficit. For a population already reeling from a 320% cumulative inflation rate over just the last 8 years, the move is a gut punch. Reports from the bazaar indicate that the official account of poverty has now expanded to 36% of the entire population. And in a sign of how bad the times are, pastry shops, nut vendors, and other things that were traditional staples of Iranian social life, like the coffee houses, if you will, these report that demand have plummeted by half. No one wants to buy, and those who do buy are increasingly doing so through installment plans or post-dated checks. That's right. For those of you that have made fun of people using Klarna or things like that to DoorDash Taco Bell, and they're doing monthly installments, they are doing that in Iran on massive scales with pastries. Yes, my wife just called it in the back. Caleb Hammer would have a conniption. No, Gabby, actually, you're right. You are right. They should call up Caleb Hammer. I'm sure that the Iranian Islamic theocratic state would absolutely call up Caleb Hammer and fly him out there in order to be able to lecture them on economics. I'm sure that that will go over great. Yeah, it's not a good situation, my friends. The government of Iran is trapped. It can't implement the deep structural reforms that are necessary to save itself. It can't privatize state enterprises. It can't end corruption. It can't create a business friendly environment. It can't support anything that it needs for long term health without risking the stability of the regime. At the same time, sanctions show no sign of being lifted, leaving a country in a state of perpetual economic siege. It is doomed. As the winter of 2025 deepens, the narrative that Iran has been pushing for years of being a stronghold against foreign influence, that is falling apart. It is being replaced by the reality of a state that cannot provide clean water. It cannot provide air. It does not have stable ground. It doesn't have a living wage. It doesn't have anything to be able to support its people. The only thing now that is keeping it limping along is the shadow fleet. And that is more or less being cracked down upon in a far more precise manner than ever before. Arguably something that has become easier due to the sheer number of vessels involved thanks to the Russians, Venezuelans, and more entities also taking part in it. The Ukraine war had created a massive shadow fleet alliance. In March of 2022, Iran and Russia had signed the Maritime Cooperation Protocol in Moscow. Russia built its own shadow fleet, copying many of the tactics that were pioneered by Iran. This has created a global dark fleet of hundreds of tankers operating outside the norm of international maritime law. Dozens and dozens of tankers began to operate under dual registration, Iranian ownership with Russian flags, or vice versa. As an example of this, you have one vessel, the MTNS Century ship, which was flagged to Cameroon, but it was insured by the Ingolstadt, which is a Russian insurer, and then that ship was managed by Soroush Sarzamin, which was Iranian. It's all kind of mixed together there. From here then, the Caspian Maritime Operations Center in Astrakhan would coordinate both fleets, using GLONASS and BEDO, not GPS, for navigation in order to avoid tracking. Anything and everything is being done in order to try and skirt the sanctions. But that, my friends, is what finally then brings us back to where we started on December 10th. President Trump would announce that U.S. forces has seized Skipper, a sanctioned oil tanker that was transporting Venezuelan oil. Skipper is one of the over 1,000 oil tankers it is now estimated of the Shadow Fleet that carry oil exports from sanctioned countries. This includes not just Russia or Iran, but Venezuela, North Korea, and so much more. Skipper has been under surveillance by U.S. regulators for years, having previously transported cargoes from Iran, and that vessel was actually originally named the Odessa when it was sanctioned, but of course, that was changed, as many vessels that had been sanctioned would do so in order to avoid being tracked. The U.S. Treasury would issue a statement in 2022 that would list it alongside 8 other vessels that it said were part of a, quote, vast, complex, and interwoven global network of front companies that are used to facilitate oil shipments, end quote. This was a massive smuggling network. And the operation in question that got it sanctioned, that put it on the radar in the first place, that involved blending oil to conceal the Iranian origins of the shipments, and then exporting it around the world in support of Hezbollah and other Iranian proxies. This is something that it had been carrying on for years. In fact, in just the past 2 years, there has been a total of more than 80 days in which there is evidence of the Skipper engaging in AIS spoofing in order to obscure its location. In 2024, 3 AIS spoofings by the Skipper were recorded in Egypt, Iran, the Mediterranean Sea, Ghana, and Nigeria. This is not an innocent vessel. It is very obvious what has been happening, and as technology has gotten better, it has been much, much easier to track. Matt Smith, head U.S. analyst of the consulting firm Kepler, would say Skipper was covertly loaded with 1.1 million barrels of oil in mid-November, and the ship appeared to be headed for Cuba, though it had been stopped offshore from Venezuela since it was loaded. Venezuela under Nicolas Maduro would of course call the seizure an act of piracy, and Vladimir Putin would even reach out personally to show his support. President Trump would in turn vow to impose a, quote, complete and total blockade, end quote, on sanctioned oil tankers that were moving in and out of Venezuela, and that the ruling Maduro regime is nothing more than a foreign terrorist organization. Things are escalating, my friends. And the seizure of Skipper comes at the same time as Ukraine has begun attacking shadow oil tankers that have been transporting Russian oil, part of its broader initiative to reduce Russian oil revenue that fund Moscow's war machine. Under assault from US seizures and Ukrainian military strikes, the Shadow Fleet now faces far greater risk than ever before. Because of this, some fleet operations and oil trade volumes are likely going to be deterred, as traders and other facilitators reassess the cost and benefit of Shadow Fleet oil movements. For some, it's simply not worth it, because now they could potentially easily be caught. Skipper's true location had been identified using modern tanker tracking technologies and satellite imagery, despite its operators' attempts to falsify its position, demonstrating that enforcement authorities are able to now track illicit oil shipments even through the shadows. Now, what this means for Iran with its crumbling economy and country that, again, if you have not seen my water crisis video, go watch that, it is quite literally and figuratively falling apart, and that is certainly not a good thing. Even if it can be assumed that all of this will result or be a trigger for renewed protests, which are impossible to predict in advance, of course, there is no guarantee that any of these protests will actually work in the first place, and then it will be different from what has occurred in the past. There was the 2009 Green Movement that followed alleged election fraud, the late 2017 protests that were sparked by the worsening economic crisis, there was the 2019 protest that came after fuel price hikes, and of course the 2022 protest that followed the death of the young Iranian woman, Mahsa Amini, and all of these things were crushed. Protests generally do not work in Iran. Still, change may come to Iran at some point. Its last lifeline has been the Shadow Fleet, and as I said here before, the fleet's effectiveness is now severely weakening. What we can say for certain, though, then, is that things are likely going to get far worse for Iran before it is that they get better. And so with that, my friends, we're going to be ending things here today. Thank you all very much for watching. I really do appreciate it. Let me know in the comment section below what it is that you'd like to see next. And this has some pretty bad foreshadowing. Usually I don't like to say in the end that it's like, yes, I'm not saying that the country is going to collapse, and then it collapses. This, among all countries that I've talked about, probably has the greatest chance of turning into another shit show. We will see. We will see. If it happens, I'm not going to say I called it, but I certainly didn't cause it. We already explained what did. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you next time, and goodbye, my friends.